Hi, everybody, and welcome to our final speaker for the day. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Catherine von Stackelberg, Nature's Design Principles for Regenerative Systems. I'm just going to give folks a few seconds to join, and then we'll get started. We've got some more folks joining. Our numbers are going up. We'll just wait a few more seconds. Great. Okay. My name is Lissa Harris. I'm the Executive Director of Strolling of the Heifers, and welcome to the last day, the last presentation of our first ever Slow Living Summit all virtual summit. We just want to thank everybody for all of our speakers, all of our attendees who have been with us throughout the week. We want to thank our sponsors, Breakthrough Beverage and Meadows Bee Farm, for allowing us to put on this amazing summit where we've had just incredible speakers. And today's speaker is no exception. I'm going to pass it over to Jen Brandt, our Slow Living Summit coordinator. She's going to tell you a little bit more about what you're going to hear today.
Yeah, so I just want to thank everyone again for joining us this afternoon. I know it's Friday and some folks are still working, so we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day, and you will not be disappointed. We have a nice, interesting hybrid kind of farm tour. We have a regenerative expert here who's going to blow your mind with everything she knows about this. Regenerative farming's been a nice through line through this entire event. So we're really excited to have her just kick it off, and I'll let you take it away, Catherine.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And with an introduction like that, oh my gosh. And last speaker of the last day, which I know everyone's probably, sensory overload. So I think a lot of this will hopefully reinforce some of the things that we've heard over the course of the week here, and really leave us with some positive ideas about how we can take actionable strategies forward into our own professional lives, personal lives, and really design these sort of regenerative systems. So just a little introduction about myself. So Catherine von Stackelberg. I'm a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health. I wear a couple different hats, and actually all of these hats kind of come together around this common theme. But one is I'm a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health, where, it's a school of public health. So we look at the ways in which, specifically in my department, which is environmental health department, we look at the ways in which the natural environment supports well-being, sort of writ large. And that can take a lot of different forms. It's physiological metrics like reductions in blood pressure as a function of exposure to green space. It's looking at the other side of it, the way in which adverse responses result from exposure to chemicals, all of those kinds of things. So we do epidemiology, we do a lot of the science. My particular program, and where I sit, the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis, and mind you, I did my master's and my doctoral work in this program. And this program, Environmental Science and Risk Management, is actually a joint program between the Departments of Environmental Health and Health Policy and Management. So what that means is that we do all the science and we understand the science, but I think, as we've probably heard quite a bit throughout this week, the science alone is not enough. For one thing, when it comes time to designing policy or how we're actually going to respond to what we've learned from the science, that's where the policy piece comes in. And so my particular program and where I sit is actually that intersection of science and policy. So how do we take the science that we've learned about, that we know about, and how do we turn that into policy that will benefit well-being? And that gets into sort of political and economic systems, right? Because that's how policy is designed. Now, these political and economic systems sit inside the natural systems. And so that is another part of the research that I do, is sort of systems-based thinking. How can we actually look to natural systems, and how do we interact with natural systems, and how do our human-based systems interact with those natural systems? So, as you know from sort of the blurb, all of human well-being, everything from food and water and sustenance to sort of the typical extractive uses like fossil fuels and building cars and all of the things. Everything depends on the environment, actually. We talk about sustainability and this kind of thing. And my first question with sustainability is always, sustain what for whom? Monsanto will come in and will say to you, sustainability really, given a planet with an expanding population, 9 billion people, et cetera, how are we going to feed an expanding planet within the confines of the planet? Monsanto will say to you, sustainability is genetically engineered crops together with judicious use of pesticides. So, like Roundup ready crops and that kind of thing. That's sustainability. And that's not really sustainability. So this is where we get into this idea of regenerative is actually a better word. But again, these sort of social economic systems use this word sustainability. In any event, all of human well-being depends on the environment. And as I just mentioned, there's a growing body of evidence of all kinds of things. When you are recovering from an illness, if you're exposed to green space, you actually recover more quickly. There's obvious things like green space in cities leads to lower obesity and diabetes and those sorts of things, particularly in communities that are already quite impacted at sort of environmental justice kinds of issues. We know for a fact that disproportionately some of these health outcomes affect environmental justice communities, communities of color, lower socioeconomic status, et cetera. And all of that gets lifted up by interaction with green space and having green space. Even as we know that all of human well-being depends on the environment, we also see that the environment is being altered in unprecedented ways. Climate change, all of the things. We are in the era of the Anthropocene. A paper just came out in Nature Communications, maybe it was Science, that was talking about the we're in the great mass extinction, and there's yet further evidence that we are in that extinction, and there's enormous implications for reductions in biodiversity. I'll actually talk about how biodiversity relates to human health, because it does in many ways. Everything links back to nature. So when we're thinking about these social economic systems, this is when we start to think about natural capital as a way to bring the natural environment into the discourse in a policy context. And it's also true that really no pristine environments remain. We talk about conserving land and conservation and those kinds of things. And it's actually, there is sort of more or less literally no place on Earth now that is not touched by human hands. Horrible spill in the Arctic Circle right now going on. And it's made even worse because we're seeing this huge melt and the permafrost melt. So that's all sort of gushing together. And the permafrost melt, of course, is leading to the release of microbiology and critters and things and viruses potentially that had been in the permafrost for many years. So there's just really no pristine environments, even in places where we think we have them. The amount of trash on Mount Everest and things like that, I mean, just sort of horrible. So the natural environment, all of human well-being depends on the natural environment. One thing that we think about is the use of ecosystem services to actually describe and quantify the ways in which the natural environment specifically support well-being. This is another way to bring, it's an analog to natural capital. It's another way to think about how we can actually bring those benefits forward in a concrete way so that they are actually acknowledged analytically. Going back to sort of the science piece of it, so science for many, many years really focused on these kind of reductionist approaches and analyses, and even our policy decision-making was that way. So for example, non-point or point discharges to water, so we have a NIPDES program that targets point discharges to water. Everything's very sort of focused. And what we have come to realize is that we need to take a step back, and we can benefit from using systems-based thinking. So this is where this socio-ecological systems comes from. which requires a much greater integration across disciplines, behavioral sciences, social sciences, natural sciences. And this is where, again, if we look to the natural system as a model, so that nature, if you will, has been engineering and doing all sorts of things and doing quite well without us for a long time. And so we can think about how natural systems operate, and these political and social systems that are inside that, they can be designed differently to more mimic natural systems, and that will actually benefit human health, and it'll benefit the environment ultimately as well. So that's another kind of research thing where we use systems-based thinking to approach environmental issues and problems and things like that. So again, sustainability will often talk about the three-legged stool, or how we have to balance social and economic and environmental issues. But really the way to think about it is, right, it's this way. It's the economy in society, in nature. And again, when we look at natural systems, they are a complex adaptive system, much like any system is a complex adaptive system, but natural systems so much, very much so. And it's a particularly now, right, we talk about resilience and adaptation and all those things. All those terms really came out of natural systems and observations on natural systems and ecosystems. Resilience is something that was first looked at by Hollings in 1987, this tiny little citation right here, and he came up with this cycle of adaptive change. And it was observations of natural systems and how natural systems become resilient that then leads to discussions about resilience in the context of sustainability. One thing I think we've all seen from this COVID experience that we're going through now is exactly how not resilient the economic system is, right? The first thing that happened is, oh my God, people stopped, or that engine stopped turning, and all, sort of chaos ensued. COVID can really be thought of just as a shock to a system, just like it's kind of any shock to a system. It's just a virus. It's not anything more than that. What makes it so devastating for us, of course, is that it's unique and our immune systems have never seen it. And so that leads to all that. But as a consequence of this shock to our economic system, we really see how unresilient it is. And again, if we turn to natural systems, we can actually learn something, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Thing about natural systems, we have thermodynamics, which govern the physical processes. Economics does not actually follow the laws of thermodynamics because it's based on endless growth. Growth is always, right? Even now, we're talking about when are we going to go back to growth? When is the economy going to grow? How are we going to grow, GDP, more widgets, more purchasing, more people, more purchasing, more all of that. That's actually not something that the natural environment ever does. You have a period of growth, and then you have attenuation, or you even have a crash. You never have growth like that. So right out of the gate, our economic system does not follow even basic laws of thermodynamics. And there's a lot of discussion about that in the literature, and there's actually a lot of practical solutions to that, but that gets to sort of the behavioral piece with people. We think this is all we've ever known. This is what it is. We have to go back to that. We can't do something different. In point of fact, we can. We can have something called a steady state economy. We'll talk a little bit about donut economics. Actually, a number of places around the world, or Amsterdam, for example, other places are talking about adopting that as the economic model going forward. It doesn't emphasize growth. Donut economics, no one falls through the middle, but you respect planetary boundaries. The planetary boundaries being there was a paper in, the first paper was in Science, Rockström et al., the Stockholm Resilience Institute. They published a paper in 2009 that looked at 7 or 9 very specific planetary boundaries, like climate change, like freshwater use, etc. And that is really the biosphere that we find ourselves in. And donut economics takes that, uses that as the outer part of the donut, and the inner part is the social part where no people actually fall into the hole, right? So we don't have poverty and all that kind of thing. So there's lots of different ways to be creative, and it doesn't have to actually go the way that it's going now. So our human systems that operate inside these natural systems, the organizing principles are not thermodynamics. They're actually, these homo economicus, these assumptions about rational actors in an economic system, which, by the way, doesn't actually even happen at all. What really happens is behavior, which has led to a discipline called behavioral economics. And then we have governance, which is the social and political processes by which people decide and share information and take action and move forward on a much larger social level. So we develop these models that explain or predict systems behavior based on observations of natural systems, global biogeochemical cycles, and things like that. And again, use ecosystem services to describe and quantify the benefits provided by natural environments to humans. But it's important to note that as well-being measured by economic metrics, which is these things like GDP and so forth, as those things improve and as there's more growth and more consumption and all those kinds of things, still we see ecosystems are declining. And without these ecosystems, we have nothing. So again, as I said in my write-up, all of the issues that we face, everything, whether it's climate change or COVID or the locusts or decline of fresh water, biodiversity loss, novel viruses, zoonotics generally, all of these things fundamentally have a root cause, and that root cause is our flawed relationship with the natural environment, but you only have to turn to the natural environment to see the solutions. And that's going to lead me to the next hat that I wear, which is this orchard that we are putting together. So I just want to talk for a moment about ecosystem services. People probably have seen this or are familiar with this before, but these are these very specific ways in which we can start to quantify, things like clean water and food production and all of the things, all of the ways in which the natural environment supports well-being. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment folks, it's a huge team of people. They have done a set of reports, and again, I'm sure people are familiar with that. And this is really the linkage in a quantitative way between natural systems and our economic and political systems. Because once we talk about ecosystem services, now we have a direct link to the kinds of analyses that are done for policy, like cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis, those kinds of things. And we'll talk more about these nature's principles as well as sort of guiding factors. So the other hat that actually links with this, but in a somewhat different way, is and this is sort of the farm tour part of it, is that I am also an owner, along with my husband, of Ecodale Farms. And we are a work in progress, as you'll see, because we'll go outside and I have some video to show and whatnot. It's an orchard. So my husband had this idea that he wanted to get into cider. And so there's a lot of research that went into that, and trips to England and hanging out with the guys and the cellars. I mean, cider is a big thing in England and has been for sort of hundreds of years. And they have very well-established orchards. And there it's, people say, oh, is it hard cider? Well, by definition, cider is a fermented fruit. So it's more like wine. And the thing about it is, because you're tied to because you are intrinsically part of the natural environment, it's really all about the terroir. And this is sort of the model that we're following in the development of our orchard. I just included this little thing. There's one of the best. So cider is actually the original méthode traditionnelle. So méthode champenoise, which is champagne. They actually came after. Cider actually came first, but nonetheless, we follow the same principles and processes that the champagne folks use. And this is just an example of Agripar. It's a very small vineyard in Avisé in France. And they have some great champagnes. If you're really ever looking for a super celebration, you can't go wrong with this. And their highest grade champagne is Venus, which is, and it's all about the terroir. So this is our thing too. We fight for the truth of the terroir. It's these grapes, it's these apples in this land with this microbiology. It's got to be this. You could take these exact apples and grow them somewhere else, and it wouldn't taste like this. It wouldn't be like this, because you've got to have this. And we'll talk more about that, because that's really the soil microbiome, right? Just like the gut microbiome is so important for our own. The soil microbiome is the soil is the microbiome of the planet. And so everything that we do to focus on the soil and bring that out is then revealed in things that grow in the soil, just like sort of our gut. But anyway, Venus is it's 60 acres within this larger vineyard, and the champagne that comes out of these grapes, they never, just been solemnly worked, does never even used a tractor. Now I can't say we didn't do that, because we're just growing, and so we do use tractors, but this, the height of the terroir is that they actually don't even use machinery or anything like that. It's only a horse, and it's not the same horse, because it's a vineyard that's been around for a long time, but I think it's a draft that they always call Venus, and so the champagne itself is called Venus. So we're sort of in that. We are definitely doing the whole terroir. That's a huge piece of it. And when it came time to thinking about that soil microbiome, that's when we got into the idea of we realized it's a lot of work. All of this is a lot of work. And a monoculture orchard, which is honestly years ago, when my husband was sort of first thinking about this, sort of thought, well, that's how he's going to design this. Sort of quickly realized, gosh, that's a lot of work. And there's actually literally no, we consulted with Michael Phillips and all the people. There's really no way to do it without, even if you're organic, there's really no way to do it without imposing sprays and doing things, and it's just, there's a lot of moving parts, and it doesn't really work. So that's when we realized, as we did more research, that we've really got to go in this permaculture direction. Just to talk for a moment about that soil, and again, I view our orchard, as you'll see, because it's just up and coming. It's like this biological engine that's just coming to life. I mean, when you go to these orchards or these vineyards in England or Italy or France or other places that have been established for a long time, everything's working, and nobody's touched the soil for a long time, and you've got all that microbiology, and it's really all about the microbiology. What we see and what we use and what we benefit from is really all about this rhizospheric microbiome, which is everything under the ground, and the diversity there is so huge. This just shows you the number of genes and that are found in each aspect of the microbiome and of the soil microbiome. And it's very small numbers of things like plant diseases and food contamination. You get rid of all of the sort of the bad and the ugly by emphasizing the good in that microbiome. And when you do that, then of course that's when you have all that healthy growth and all of the benefits of having done it that particular way. The mycelium, which is the fungus underneath, and I'm sure people are familiar with or have seen the Secret Life of Trees and things like that. I think have some links to some of that in a couple of slides. It's so important to develop that mycelium. When you don't have colonization of fungus in the below ground root structure, that's when basically all the trouble starts. And when you develop that mycelium, which is that interaction between the plant root and all of the microbiology beyond that, that's when you actually get the resistance to pathogens and toxicity and all, it's just beneficial in every possible way. And this slide is just designed to show a few of those specific mycorrhizae and how important they really are, and that whole cycle. So this is another thing about natural systems, right? One key aspect of natural systems that human systems absolutely do not follow: natural systems have no waste. This is the waste right here, the litter and the dead stuff and the brown leaves or whatever, right? That's the waste in that sense. But there is no waste actually, because it's actually, that's the whole point of regenerative, right? I mean, it's not rocket science. It's circular, it's not linear. We are all linear. We're linear from beginning to end. We extract fossil fuels and things like that. We run it through a system, and then we have waste at the end, and we have waste along the way because we build things and there's waste products from that. And there's nothing circular or regenerative about that. But you can actually imagine, and people are starting to do that, circular economy, things like that, ways in which, and recycling doesn't quite get you there. It's close, but it's not quite, you have to take it a step beyond. And of course, recycling is a joke now anyway, because we used to send it all to China. Now we don't deal with China. And plus we're in this COVID thing, and how much more plastic can we actually generate now, right? Because everything's like single serve, takeout, this, that, and da-da-da. We can't have reusable. You're not even supposed to bring your reusable bags to the store, which is, I think that's going to change now because it's been shown that that's not actually a thing. But we're actually generating more single-use plastic now, right? Which is, it's just not how natural systems do things. It's always a circular, regenerative kind of thing. So it's a very simple principle, but very powerful in terms of in terms of what it reveals and where it gets us. I just wanted to show this little article, which was interesting, came out a little while ago, that looks at the relationship between the microbiome, the sort of the soil and farming, and how you farm and what farming practices are done. This study showed that in CAFO and large scale, the way we produce food, which is the wrong way to produce food, 100% the wrong way to produce food. The way we produce food actually leads to interactions at that microbiological level between the people who are working and the animals that are going to be the food, basically. And so what happens is, because these large scale farms and things use a lot of antibiotics and those kinds of things, those antibiotic resistant bugs, flora, gut flora, actually transfer to the workers, to the people. And so there's this interaction. COVID itself is the same kind of thing, right? We know it came from bats. Okay, so it might have come from the lab and all that. I mean, I think that I'm part of this synthetic biology group, and we're actually talking a lot about this and looking at it in some detail. And I mean, it may have come from a lab, but it probably didn't. But no matter what, it's another reflection of, for sure, we know it came from bats, and it is happily living in bats. And then it crossed to something, the pangolin, and then it went to humans. And because, of course, it had never seen humans before, it turns out humans are a great host. And so it was like, why would we bother with the bat? Let's just go right to the human. But it's, again, an example of our flawed interaction with the natural environment. Part of it is encroaching on habitat and so forth, which is why we see these increases in zoonotics. And part of it is the close proximity of things. And large scale, there's been some studies already that have come out that have looked at large scale agriculture. This is just one little example, this kind of gut bug swapping, but large scale agriculture has outcomes and implications for human health beyond just kind of the obvious things. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about that, and one of the reasons why we decided to go in the direction that we did. I just wanted to show, you're probably familiar, but biodiversity is incredibly important. And in 1 square meter of soil, okay, so as the organisms, decrease in size, they basically increase in number. So the diversity of bacteria and protozoa and all the little squirmy things that we can somewhat see, and also most of the things that we cannot see. In 1 square meter of soil, the diversity is incredible. And that diversity translates into our landscapes. And so when we do monoculture, we just reduce that biodiversity more and more and more. And this is another one of nature's principles. It's actually 2 principles. One is diversity. There's always diversity. Everyone has a niche, but there's cooperation. So yes, the individual is important, but the individual is never working for the individual. The individual is always working for the larger system. So individuals have individual actions that then lead to systemic outcomes. And when we use, going back to the other hat of the research and at the university, we use systems-based thinking to understand how these individual actions aggregate to the larger behavior and outcomes that we see at the systems level. Probably the biggest example is lockdowns. Individuals making individual actions to stay home and reduce their led to this systems outcome, which was a reduction in the incidence of COVID. And I guess now we're starting a little bit to see the other side of that, right? Which 22 states are on the increase again, because now because we couldn't really do that lockdown thing in that way, which by the way was anyway just designed to flatten the curve. We can't get rid of the curve. We're not going to get rid of the curve anyway. But the point is biodiversity. The biodiversity in soil is enormous, and it's that biodiversity that we wanted to help to foster in the best way possible as we were thinking about the design of our own orchard. And just to beat the drum, we've talked about this all throughout the week, which is even though we literally sort of at one time represented about 0.01%, not 1%, 0.01% of life on Earth. We actually are, of course, responsible for, 80% reduction in marine mammals. And, the statistics are somewhat appalling as to the effect that we are having on the natural environment. So this is another reason to try and work with the natural environment in a way that benefits both, that takes advantage of what the natural environment wants to do anyway, and also achieves the goals that we want to achieve, the things that we want to do. People sort of sometimes wonder, I think, why is biodiversity, why is diversity important? Why is biodiversity? Diversity is always important, even in the context of the sort of really horrible things that have been happening just in the last few days. Sort of, we moved past COVID now and we're into the riots and all this kind of thing. But that's also a diversity question, right? It's actually all of a piece. And what happens in a low diversity system is that, in fact, if we go back to that idea of resilience and adaptation, low diversity systems have no resilience and no ability to adapt whatsoever, because you come in and if there's a target, and this is why monoculture is a doomed beast, because you have these large swaths of the same crop. And what pest doesn't come in and see that and say, oh my God, this is paradise. This is so great. Why would I struggle if I can just go right to that? So it's a losing proposition. Whereas if you have a high diversity system, something comes in to attack, but you've got that diversity, you've got redundancy, you've got cooperation of the individuals. And so you take out a few things, but the structure and function of the ecosystem, or the system generally, can be a human system as well, continues to thrive. And that there's a strong correlation between biodiversity or diversity of any kind and the effective structure and function of a system. So you can see this sort of more pointedly, again, to go back to the language of ecosystem services, which is where we make explicit the benefits provided by the natural environment. So natural ecosystems, you get carbon sequestration, you get air, climate and air quality regulation, you've got you're probably, the lowest is probably crop production in a purely natural ecosystem, putting aside sort of foraging and that kind of thing, which is a thing. But in a natural ecosystem, you've got multiple habitats and biodiversity. Water flow is regulated and managed in a more integrative way, etc. The extreme to that is the way we do things, which is intensive cropland, where we maximize essentially one ecosystem service, right? And that's crop production. But we sacrifice all these others because there's no way. You're not sequestering carbon because you've got these shallow roots. They're annual crops. It's not, it doesn't do anything there. It doesn't regulate water quality. Erosion is a huge issue. We're using pesticides and nutrients. Now we're going into water bodies. Now we're getting hypoxic dead zones. Then in the Gulf of Mexico, the hypoxic zone, every year it grows larger, even though we know it's because of agricultural practices in the Midwest. We can see, we know, we can connect all the dots, but we somehow can't stop that because we're wedded to this system. And of course it's connected to the political and economic systems because we're growing a lot of soybean and other crops, things that are sent overseas, biofuels, all that kind of thing. So it does require some thinking about how to restructure, which can be done. It sounds daunting. It's actually not that daunting. But anyway, so you can think of a hybrid system though, where you have a crop or something, some agriculture, multifunctional agricultural landscape. Food forest, we'll talk about those. Permaculture, which is what our orchard is. There's a lot of different nuances that are all essentially around the same idea, which is maximizing ecosystem services. And when you do that, when you have this diversity of different perennial and annual crops and things like that, which permaculture does a lot of that, now you're maximizing across all of these ecosystem services. So again, looking to the way in which the natural system organizes itself and does things, if you will, the principles by which natural ecosystems are organized. How can we restructure some of our systems, particularly things like food, which are fundamentally part of a natural system? It's so obvious to see that that's the case. How can we redesign those systems to more effectively achieve all the goals that we want to achieve and still maintain the integrity of that system? So permaculture. And again, we didn't do this as kind of a really conscious thing, and I'll show you. But so permaculture, it does have a kind of a tradition, if you will. It was, if you're not familiar with it, was founded by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. And if you just Google that, there are some tremendous YouTube videos and other things that come up that are, absolutely just really, really terrific. And it is based on these 12 principles. There's these core ideas, which is earth, care for the earth, fair share, which is this idea of equity within the natural system, but equity in our social systems as well, and people care. And if we kind of think of those as our core principles, then we have these ways in which this is implemented. So the first thing about permaculture is, and we did this for I'd say almost a couple years before we even planted a tree or did anything, is watching, observing, seeing what's happening. See which way does the wind blow, which way does the water go, what happens when it rains, where do the storms come in, it's a lot of observing and watching what happens when things happen, and then starting to actually interact with that and use that in the best way possible. So you can see, oh, well, the water always wants to go that way. Well, how can I use it? How should I be swaling that, or should I swale it a little differently? How can I actually use that? And we did some of that. I'll show you in our orchard. We did quite a lot of that as we were planning our orchard. Energy. So this is another thing, is that all natural systems rely on the sun for immediate energy. It's photosynthesis, and then we go from there. And from that initial photosynthesis that is the primary energy source. And of course, we are using ancient photosynthesis. That's what fossil fuels are. We're not actively using the energy that we have available to us. renew. Again, there are strategies to go in the right direction, and we should be putting our energies in. We should be putting our energy into that energy because that's where the energy is. But that is a key piece of permaculture as well, is catching and storing energy and seeing where the sun is on a daily cycle, and of course on a seasonal cycle, and how to leverage that and how to best capture that. Obtaining a yield. I mean, so the thing is, you're not just doing this for the heck of, I mean, you know, we have a goal, right? You want to obtain a yield. You want to have apple trees that produce apples that make cider. You want to have a thriving garden. You want to have a thriving food root cellar, a filled root cellar. You do want to obtain a yield, and so that is something to focus on. A thing about systems, and when we use systems thinking, all systems, when we start to think about these individual actions that lead to these larger outcomes, the first thing that you notice, and the first thing that you do, and the first thing that, you know, I talk about with my students, for example, is that there are feedback loops. And you can see those feedback loops when you observe natural systems. So part of that is to identify and figure out where the feedback loops are that you can leverage. So a feedback loop is, the simplest one is when the population, you have a birth, you have births, and as you have births, you have a increased population. And so that's a feedback loop. But then you have regulation in the form of the death rate, which comes in, right? And so, and you can have feedback loops in social systems. You can identify the feedback loops, and it's important to identify those because they can represent actual leverage points for making changes in a system. And certainly in the permaculture design, you want to see those feedback loops in your natural systems that you're using. Use and value renewable resources and services. Produce no waste. I mean, that's the gold standard. I can't say that we are entirely there, but we try to be very close. You know, it's a work in progress for all of us. Design from patterns to details. Nature is replete with patterns and designs, you know, fractals and things like that. Those are all patterns, and you can see those patterns in nature, and you can use those patterns. So one thing, I don't have it, but what a lot of people do, you know, in permaculture systems, and you know, our orchard is permaculture, but I can't say our whole entire lives are permaculture based. But what a lot of permaculture systems have is the spiral herb garden and things like that. There's a lot of leveraging of patterns and using patterns at different scales to achieve the goals that you want. Integration rather than segregation. So this is a little bit about the biodiversity, but it's also the principle of cooperation in natural systems, that there is a niche for everything, and that we integrate these rather than separate. So we don't want to actually have you know, these individual crops. We want things integrated. And so in our orchard, what we tried to do is follow that principle. So the focus is, of course, the apple tree. That's the obtain a yield. But for every apple tree, there should be a plum or a pear, and then there should be a nitrogen fixer, which for us is typically a black locust, and that's sort of the upper canopy. It's kind of like a food forest as well. Then there's a middle canopy, which are all the berries: currants, serviceberry, raspberry, blackberry, blueberry, all of the berries. And then there's the lowest canopy, which are things like all the native flowers and plants, yarrows and comfrey. There's a lot of comfrey. Comfrey is an important piece of it. All of the pollinators, all of those kinds of things are then the lowest canopy. And so there's an integration of all those pieces. Permaculture likes to talk about using small and slow solutions. So it's an evolutionary process that takes a certain amount of time. And ultimately, the idea is then you have this self-sufficient system that slowly grows to be what it is, and then it largely takes care of itself through this use of small and slow solutions. Of course, using and valuing diversity. That's again, this going back to the soil microbiome, the gut microbiome, in every way, diversity and biodiversity is always a really important piece. Using edges and valuing the marginal. So permaculture, one of the observations that comes out of permaculture is that the edge of the forest and where the forest transitions, where natural systems or ecosystems transition, are very powerful places, and there's a lot happening in those places, and that's a place where you can actually leverage and use to, again, obtain this kind of yield. And then being able to respond to change and being creative and recognizing that change is inevitable. For a long time in sort of the ecological literature, again, being sort of more the academic view of the world, there's this idea of equilibrium in nature, and that there's and this is the kind of the fundamental basis of, for example, I do a lot of work in the chemical world or chemical exposures world. When we're remediating chemicals, we always want to say we want to go back to what it looked like before the chemical was there. But in point of fact, natural systems are highly, highly dynamic and highly, highly variable and highly energetic. And so there's always changes occurring. And that's actually part of what makes natural systems resilient one way or the other. There's always a resilience there. And part of that is being able to respond to change very creatively. One of our role models, gurus, somebody that we researched a lot, and I'm German, I don't sound it, but von Stackelberg, probably could tell from the name. Sepp Holzer, who's in Austria, was very inspirational for us. This is another individual who inherited a farm in Austria at the same elevation that we are, it's about 1,400 feet. And so it's a fairly northern climb and pretty, not necessarily so friendly. And Sepp Holzer kind of is another independently. Bill Mollison and Holmgren are out of Australia. Sepp Holzer is from Austria, so that's obviously a completely different place. So independently, Sepp Holzer also came up with this, essentially this permaculture idea at his farm in Austria. And it's, again, there's a bunch of, he gives lectures and does things, and I'm not sure TED Talk per se, but there are lots of resources about him out on the worldwide interwebs, and it's worth checking out because his place is really, really inspirational. And he's, in a kind of a mountainous climb, and so he's got a real integration of perennial and annual and just all kinds of diversity, and everything kind of functions without even a lot of input from him. These are some, I think once the slides are available, you have to sort of cut and paste these things, but there are some really good kind of introductory, and not even introductory, but more in-depth resources about permaculture and permaculture principles. This one is actually really interesting about why sort of traditional farmers criticize permaculture and all that kind of thing. So there's some interesting things to watch there. And here again are the principles of permaculture. So what I wanted to do now is actually see if I'm going to share. So our orchard, we have two orchards, and one is the so-called upper orchard is where we planted all of the actual English cider varietals of apples. So these earlier pictures that I had, that one picture that I had that is actually of our orchard, which now I can't seem to locate. Oh, here it is. These are actually out of our orchard. So these are actually English cider varietals predominantly, and there's a gabillion different ones. There's probably 80 or 90. So there's overall in the two orchards, we have some 1,200, 1,300, 1,300 apple trees. And then we have almost an equal amount of the so-called companions. And the lower orchard, which is a little bit further away, is the place where we have the American heirlooms. And so I did take what I was gonna do is stop sharing this and actually share a couple of videos perhaps. And I had to figure out, my photos was not going to let me actually do this. So let's see if we can do this. I don't know, it's probably not going to be big enough, but. So this is the so-called lower orchard at Echodale Farm. And this is actually more of the American heirlooms as opposed to the English cider varietals. So we'll just take a little walk in there. And to do that, of course, we have to do it one by one. So I started off here with a little bit. So this part of the orchard is, well, of course, all of it is still a work in progress, but this part is a little bit more densely planted than we would like. So the emphasis now is really on the so-called companions, which are that lower canopy, currants, all the different kinds of berries, the mid-level canopy. And then you have the lower canopy, the lowest canopy, which is ideally not really sort of grass and whatnot, but various kinds of herbs and native perennials, right? Like things like comfrey, of which there's a lot in the upper orchard. You want to have various kinds of things with roots that really help work that soil and build up that microbiome. So what we have here is that design strategy, though, where, so we have some apple trees and plum trees and pear trees and whatnot, and then we have things like elderberries. So I'm not going to be able. I did get, though, there. Yeah. So there we see. There we see the so-called companions, which are things like elderberries. These are elderberries here. Further up, we're going to have actually currants, a lot of native pollinators that are helpful. You know, various kinds of milkweeds and things. And then as we move through, you know, there's things like this. This is all currants, lots of black currants, red currants, white currants. Again, that's that lower level canopy that goes around the trees. And then ultimately, this gets pushed out by things like comfrey. Which we are still, you know, that's still very much a bit of a work in progress. Now, I wanted to just quickly show you also here. So this is in the upper orchard. This looks like a lake. It's actually a pond. What we did in the upper orchard, and I think I might be able, I probably have to switch devices to actually walk out there. But what we did there was, it's a hilly, rocky, it had been land that had been logged over a gabillion times. Everybody had extracted everything out of it they possibly could. It had been, you know, used for all that. It was really just not super happy in that sense. So what we did is we kind of actually scooped it all out and created, because you, again, observation, there's a place, and I think maybe I took a video of that. Nope, this is a static picture. And now I have a video of it somewhere. Sorry, so this is, thanks for sharing. There's a stream, there's a babbling brook thing that comes into this area. So we actually created this whole pond area and scooped out all the topsoil and then used that as the basis for the for planting the trees. And that turns out, I think this might be a video. So that water comes in kind of, yeah, right up from here, from a beaver pond. And so this was somewhat constructed, actually, which is another sort of permaculture thing, is that you go in and you construct, and then you build up, and you kind of go from there. And, you know, we have wildlife and things that are coming in and colonizing. This is really recent. This is only in the last couple of years that this was actually done. And this also is a microclimate. So there's a quick whiz of the trees there. This is also a microclimate. That pond creates a microclimate, and it actually, you know, that's we're in northern Vermont here, so it's not always super hospitable. And that pond creates a microclimate for us that is super useful and helps to actually make it warmer when it needs to be warmer and stuff like that. So let me go back to the PowerPoint, and I wanted to just show you quickly, because ours is kind of a work in progress, but let's see if this even works. This was, again, totally inspirational. This was one of our inspirations as we were putting together our plan. And it's a much better representation of where we're headed, or where we want to be.
One day I can remember where I was in the orchard and looking at this organic orchard. Was wonderful that it functions as an organic orchard, but it doesn't function as an ecosystem.
So this is a guy who had it had a full orchard and actually dug it up.
Emphasizing, well, let's stop the negative. I rather take my energy and say, okay, what should we do? So we tore out most of the trees and began replanting in a permaculture design, not a monocultural design, not just an apple tree orchard design, but right away as a mixed planting. So the basis of the design is the trios: nitrogen fixer, then an apple, then a pear or a plum, could be a cherry. And so that nitrogen fixer fixes all the nitrogen or gives all the fertility needed to the fruit trees on either side. Not just the fruit trees, it would also be the fruit shrubs and other plants as well that you
locust.
The great beauty of these planting design in a 3 different species configuration is that if an insect lands in one, for example, in the apple tree, he can't go into the nitrogen fixer because there's predators there waiting for him. He can't go into the pear, and even if he does, he doesn't affect the pear. And so he's got a far way to go till he reaches the next apple. It's every 3 trees would be an apple. And the next apple is not even the same cultivar. When we were certified organic, we had 12 cultivars of apples, just apples. Now we have, just in apples, we have over 100 cultivars. We have 18 cultivar pears, several plums, cherries. We have a range of cherries, I think about 7. Peaches planted.
Apricots.
We have pawpaws planted. We have kiwis, grapes, mulberries, small fruit, gooseberries, red currants, black currants, Saskatoon berries. Basically, our goal is anything that will grow as a fruit in southern Quebec, we want to have it. We put both annual and mostly perennial vegetables now in the permaculture orchard. So the goal being, once it's established, we don't have to be replanting, but we still take advantage of spots where we have sun. For example, on the at the base of the honeysuckles, which is our nitrogen fixer, we put climbing plants. So eventually we will have grapes on all of them and kiwi on all of them. But in the meantime, we still can grow cucumbers, peas, and beans. So all our climbers go on our nitrogen fixing trees. Once all this variety kicks in, once it's getting going and it's established, then the insects come, then the birds come. We have snakes now, like we've never seen so many snakes. We have all kinds of frogs. One day when the honey locusts were in bloom, I stopped for 10 minutes just to do a survey, a quick survey of what's going on. You could hear the insects in that tree. In 10 minutes, I counted 36 species, not individuals. They were hundreds in one branch.
Bee hotels.
Bees are in big trouble, I hear. Big trouble, huge losses. I wouldn't know. We went from 4 hives that wintered over. We started with 8 in the fall. and there was only 4 survived. So yeah, there is big losses. We lost 50% of our hives. But we went from 4 hives to 23 hives during the summer, basically because the bees have so much of an abundance of food through the succession and the biodiversity of trees. The honey locusts flower almost up to the end of June. And in between May 1st and the end of June, there is some tree in the whole succession of trees that is flowering. So that instead of having 10 days of apple blooms, we now have 60 days of tree blooms before the main honey flow of clover. There is some work, but it's so much less, and the abundance is really there to prove. I have nothing to envy conventional orchardists. I haven't fertilized this block since it was planted in 2007, so that's 6 years. No fertility, no fertilizer. Nobody does that. Everybody fertilizes, not just every year, but sometimes several times in the year. The output is huge, not just in diversity, but in taste. We had an open day this weekend, so people would come and you give them one of these plums and they go, excuse me. And after they've tasted one, they say, that's great. You never taste such a sweet and delicious plum in the store. Of course, the whole system is not geared towards taste. It's geared to shelf life. It's not a system that's geared to giving you the maximum pleasure. And one of my goals for the farm is bringing back the wow in food. We've lost the wow. How often do you get wowed by food in the grocery store? If you go down the row, everything is certain date. We function with 10-day windows. So if, say, now we're early September, we're picking in rows that all the trees will be ripe in a 10-day window. It's either the apples or the pears or the plums. They're already in this window. It's efficient because you go down the rows and you can pick. So even if you don't do a direct marketing and somebody wants to pick everything and take it to market, they still only have to go down certain lanes on certain dates. So you can simply have 2 or 3 boxes with you, and you would put it in a separate box. We have huge abundance here, surpluses of all kinds of things. We just had an open day. We are giving 160 pounds of apples to members. Come pick, it's free. That's 4 bushels. Most people didn't even they didn't know what to do if they took 4 bushels. That's part of the abundance. So yes, we think of that ethic of sharing the surplus as sharing with people. And that's true. We should. But we shouldn't forget that that principle really has 2 sides to it. Sharing the surplus with people and sharing the surplus with nature. We don't need to have the attitude that, oh, we have a certain insect in the orchard that's eating one of my fruit. Oh, we have birds coming and pecking some of my fruit. What's wrong with sharing some of your harvest with them? They're working day and night to take care of your orchard for you. I've had people just walking around shaking their head like they were in a daze because they said, everything I've learned, everything I've done in my orchard is contrary to what I see here. It makes sense what I see, but it doesn't jive with what I know and what I've done. So the future is getting enough people to see that 1, it's possible, 2, it's viable, and 3, it makes so much sense. Why am I not doing it? The only thing wrong with these plums is you can never eat just one.
All right, so So that was really the inspiration for us, you know, as we were doing all this research and figuring out what are we going to do, how are we going to do this, and we're not so far from Quebec, so this was actually a really important discovery for us, and is the thing that we're really emulating. Now this guy has, you know, quite a few years on us, so we're just at the beginning, but we are, you know, that's really the thing that we're trying to go for. Now, technologically, seems to be not quite right. Okay. So the other thing that we're doing, that we're trying to move into, is actually thinking about going in a biodynamic direction. This is even yet another step beyond permaculture, really. Biodynamics is based on actually the 1920 lectures by Rudolf Steiner, who's actually the same person, right, who did Montessori and all that kind of thing. And you can actually go and listen to them. They're really interesting. They were also in the German originally, but they're now in English. Biodynamics is yet another, it's actually sort of a step beyond permaculture, I would say. And well, maybe we'd go for biodynamic certification at some point. But the idea is that you inoculate using these preparations, and you grow all these preparations yourself, obviously, because you know, in a diverse orchard like this, of course, you're going to have all that. And so we're kind of experimenting with that. Again, anecdotal, but biodynamic wines, anyone who's a wine drinker and who has tried biodynamic wines, is it the biodynamics or what is it? But they actually are, there's just something about it that's better. And so my husband's like, well, it may not actually be the biodynamics, but the fact that you're paying such close attention, that you're so involved in what you're working with. And so it almost doesn't, you know, is it actually these preparations, or is it really that interaction with the natural environment that's leading, that is leading to that? Yes, so that I was just going to show this quick thing because
Hey there guys, my name is Jordan from Happen Films, and today we'll be checking out Purple Pear, a biodynamic and permaculture farm run by Kate Beveridge and Mark Brown.
So the big thing about biodynamics is you must have animals as well. You can't just have the plants and whatever. So that's another thing. We have
We've
horses.
always been passionate about food, particularly feeding children. Growing food, which has been my passion, married with Kate's passion of educating children, and we just have to feed kids really good food so that they can develop to be good humans. I started in organic growing. You know, putting poison on your food just made no sense. And it developed from there through permaculture and ultimately to biodynamics. This is a mandala market garden. We have 6 circular annual beds. This centre bed is planted out particularly for beneficials. So what we do here is we provide the habitat for things that are going to be of benefit to us in controlling pests. We have a pond in the middle, and the little birds like to come and get a drink, and whilst they're here, they'll grab a few bugs. The bromeliads are a fabulous breeding ground for little green frogs, and the spots around the outside are a great place for lizards to sun themselves. So lizards in particular, the little lizards, eat a lot of snails' eggs. And so the snails don't actually get to become snails, they become lizard food. It just made complete sense to me to be working with nature and not against it because, well, basically I'm fairly lazy, and why would you make it hard for yourself? We have habitat over there for the blue-tongued lizard as well, and
which is kind of one of the key principles. So I'm going to move on from there because I know we don't have a ton of time left, and I'm not sure. Do you? Is there the opportunity for questions and discussion and that kind of thing? Okay. I will make these slides available, so I'm not sure exactly what form that takes, but we will, that will happen, and so you'll have this resource anyway. And there are a few more slides, but I think, again, in the interest of time, that maybe we should open it up.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. We do have some questions. Just for our attendees to
Hey
know
guys,
that,
Sorry.
it's okay, that this panel has been recorded, and I can't speak today, and will be available for all of our attendees, and we'll make sure we get that out. And your slides, of course, will be available. But yeah, let's get right to questions, because we do have some questions here. Rebecca Mitchell has a comment and a question. She says, I would imagine that cloning of anything is an atrocity in terms of biodiversity. And her question is, how do you explain to a farmer how to have biodiversity with high yield production?
So it depends on what the high yield is. So in the sense of when there's diversity, you have high yield, and you will probably have higher yield per plant, if you will, but you're not going to have the higher yield of exactly the same thing, right? That's the distinction. But you will have higher yield with less effort in a diverse environment like that. Does that make sense? Does that somewhat answer the question?
Yeah, I can, if Rebecca wants to type in a follow-up question, that's fine, and we could always unmute her if she wanted to ask you a follow-up question too.
Right. So basically, all of these models, this model of multifunctional agricultural landscapes and that sort of thing. And by the way, I did have other slides that you will get that actually then move into biomimicry, which is this way. We can just move through it very quickly, which is actually looking to nature functions to design other things like, knee braces and all these kinds of things. But the idea that it's just a completely different way of doing things when we use these multifunctional agricultural landscapes. And so we can't focus on the yield of any one thing. So it's not, we're going to maximize the McDonald's potatoes or whatever, but you are going to get higher yield for everything, just sort of as Steffan's actual functioning permaculture orchard showed, that you do get very high yield across the diversity that you have, but you don't have, if your goal is to just, have potatoes for McDonald's or whatever, well, you're not gonna have that, because it's a fundamentally different concept, but you'll ultimately have higher yield of everything across the board.
Thank you, Catherine. That does answer my question. And if they want to have just one plant, then they're not going to be interested in the diversity. So.
Well, right. I mean, and we've been so conditioned to kind of monoculture, because again, the system is, it's just, again, fundamentally all wrong. It's a question of scale. We have this idea of, go big, everything's big and everything's at scale. It's the same thing that's causing tension with the use of renewables, right? So here in Northern Vermont, it's very popular. We put up these wind things that goes back to the grid. We have to see these wind things, but we don't actually benefit from the power. And that's not to say it's not a good idea, because of course it's a great idea. But again, you want the diversity and you want the small scale. So those wind towers are enough to actually power the entire town of Sutton, let's say, or the entire town of Sheffield, or at the community level. It certainly is enough for that. So it's kind of the equivalent of the yield. But then when you go back to the grid, it doesn't actually make sense, because when you need the power the most, you don't know if you have it and all this kind of thing. So it's a question of scale. And it's the same thing with these multifunctional agricultural landscapes. Now, again, the Monsanto people will say, well, you'll never get enough yield to feed the planet. you will actually, but you have to do it in a completely different way. Things have to be much more hub and spoke, and not, we can't be growing huge things in one place and then moving them to other places and at that scale. It does have to be completely reconfigured. And you will see that these kinds of permaculture solutions are solutions. You go on YouTube and whatnot, and you will see there's an endless sort of inspirational array of how David Holmgren in particular, Bill Maul, the original guys who then went out and spread the message, have gone out and designed places that were drought that now have that are now flourishing, and all those kinds of things. So, and again, you get multiple benefits across multiple domains, and yield is one of them, but not in the way that we're used to thinking about it.
Got it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Catherine. Our next question is from Tom Newmark, who was one of our keynote speakers last week. He says, biodynamics, have you seen studies of ecological outcomes, SOM, biodiversity, soil structure, water management, for land under biodynamic management?
Yeah, so there are, and now I'm not going to be able to pull it up, but I should be able to pull it up and provide that as a resource after. Yes, so there have been some increasingly studies that have been done, and I think maybe they're even available at the Biodynamic Association Demeter website, which is that there have been studies that have looked at so it's like a case control kind of thing. So we as much as possible, looking at the biodynamic way, and then in a very similar climates, the control variables are similar across the two sites, but one is doing either just straight organic or even conventional. Conventional, I think you'd see there are statistically significant differences across those outcomes. And for organic versus biodynamic, I'd have to go back and remind myself of the literature, but there are a number of studies that have gone into that do actually, rigorous studies that look at let's say a food production system over time across biodynamic practices versus non-biodynamic. And then there's this kind of anecdotal stuff of the market, which is things like biodynamic wines and, the market share that they have, which is not the same. That's not the same as those kinds of outcomes, but it's reflects that the thing that you're looking for, which is the food that you're eating or the wine that you're drinking, the product that you're developing, is improved as a function of these practices. So yeah, those studies definitely exist. Of course, I should be able to whip out the citation, and I can, just not in real time.
Well, we can always, Tom just replied that he has not seen those studies. He'd be very interested.
Oh yeah, no, they exist. They definitely exist. Yeah, I remember we kind of looked into it as well, because we just thought, why is it that all these biodynamic things, they're really, really good? Is it just hocus pocus, or what is it? So it's not clear that I will say this, it's not clear that it is a function of the preparations. I'm not sure you can actually isolate that. It's more at the larger, it's more at gross level, which is everything that encompasses biodynamics, which is more than just those preparations, because you're following cycles of the moon and you're just really paying attention to everything that's growing. And so can you really tease out whether it's that versus the specific preparations? Because honestly, some of it is really, when we're inoculating the compost, we're kind of like, Brian, my helper guy, Brian and I are like, what are we doing? Do we even know what we're doing? We're not even sure what we're doing, but we're supposed to inoculate with at every, the pile every so often. So we're like, okay, we'll do it, but is it really doing anything? I don't know. But yeah, no, there are studies that as a management style, which is at a higher level, I think, than, sort of is the chamomile preparation really doing what it says it does, and that kind of thing.
Thanks. Our next question is, are all the crops intended for harvest or just the apples?
Right. So we're sort of sorting that out now. And so I'm kind of in charge of the companions, because of course my husband has a plan for the apples and more or less a plan for the pears, which is Perry. Cider makers will tell you. For some reason, they're making cider, but the pinnacle of success is your Perry, which is actually a pear-based thing. I don't fully understand it, but so that's that. So I'm actually this year we will have enough currants, for example. Well, already last year we had so many currants. I was like, oh my God. And a little currant goes a long way, but it's an interesting, you don't see those everywhere. You don't go to the supermarket and there they all are. So I called up Bar Hill, Caledonia Spirits. And I said, creme de cassis. I mean, you guys distill, like, couldn't you use a bunch of currants and then we could like co-brand and be like Eckodale Farm and Northern Vermont and you do that and, it'll be like this thing. And they were like, yeah, absolutely, 100% we'll do that. And we'll take all the currants that you have. Actually, we'll use a lot of, this is pre-COVID, of course. We'll use a lot of them, in the bars and whatever as fresh. So now, is that a vibe? So when you sit down, do the spreadsheets and what it takes to actually harvest those and all that, still working out those details. But there are certainly enough things that come off of the other things that it's not our primary in terms of business plans. It's not our primary focus financially, if you will. But that said, there's all kinds of things that so I have this whole line of, I just got a little apothecary thing. So I'm doing various kinds of salves and tinctures and oxymels. So cider, my husband hates this, but cider that's not going to really make it as cider makes a terrific vinegar. So that's the point at which he's like, I'm just going to dump it out on the ground. And I'm like, yeah. Brian and I are like, no, don't dump it out. We'll use it for vinegar. And he's like, no, that's just a sign of failure that my cider has become vinegar. And we're like, vinegar is not a bad thing. People love vinegar, a good vinegar. And so now we're using the cast off cider as vinegar as a base for like these. And then of course, honey, because of the bees, we don't have our own bees, but our neighbor right here has a ton of honey. So you put that all together with some, so now you've got these infused vinegars. Last year I did an elderberry, nasturtium, separately, not all as one. Elderberry, currant, nasturtium, chive. We have endless amounts of like the garlicky alliums writ large. So there are all these kinds of products. And our thought was, we're going to kind of see what takes, because the business model is, anyone who's familiar with Northern Vermont, we have Hill Farmstead, which is it's a brewer, it's beer, so it's not terroir or anything like that. But that business model tells you that if you have a product that people like, they will crawl all over themselves to get to it. So we have a tasting kitchen. It's a farmhouse that's, the pipes froze, turned out to be a good thing because now we've converted it into this tasting kitchen. And so we will offer these kinds of products, and we have some strategic partnerships with other small farms in the area. Our friend who does beef and various asparagus and other kinds of things, she's got a farm stand, we'll sort of share things. So we'll see what people are interested in and what they aren't. And so we do plan to do that. How much of a financial piece it is not clear yet. And so, yeah, some of it's probably not going to be worth it, but at a minimum, it'll be enough for us and our immediate community. And that may actually be enough because, again, that permaculture thing of people care, fair share, all that you share it more widely. Is it going to be a real money maker in that sense? Probably not. But there are so many opportunities to use those things that we will, and that is part of the plan.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. So are you familiar with Citizen Cider?
Yes.
Yeah, so I figured you would be, just want to ask in case. So full disclosure, I used to work there. So they're lovely, and Brian, who is the head cider maker, when I was there, there would be at least 15 to 20 ciders that we didn't even put out to the public that were like bizarre blends. But I just want to give a plug for him. He's a scientist, he's a genius. So if you want to be connected with him to have conversations about trial and error.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd be able to make that connection because
Exactly. Yeah, my husband does these recon trips. So the most recent one, this is one where you could travel still. The most recent one was out to California to visit various vineyards and talk to various, and there were a couple where it's a vineyard, but they actually have cider as a little piece of it. It's not the main piece, but it's kind of a side piece. And oh yeah, I mean, it's, so much fun. And then there were actual cider makers like Mission Trail. Mission Trail is really great. Snowdrift, which is in Pacific Northwest. We have great on the East Coast as well, but the West Coast is where they just have a little bit more of an established tradition. And then of course there's England, which is a whole separate category. But we've done some hanging out and recon like that, and that's one that we haven't done, but it sounds super promising.
yeah, they based their ciders on the Spanish tradition, so that's
right, which is a little, yes, exactly, which is a little bit different. So ours is the English, which is super dry, light, sparkling, again more in that champagne direction. Yes, French, Spanish, very quite different kind of cider, still delicious, but it's a so I don't know those details, but it's a different fermentation process, right? I think you're probably right. So we do like a lot of cold fermentation. And they maybe don't do it quite like that. And they maybe use oak barrels. We use stainless steel initially, and then we go into disgorge into bottles. I'm not sure when they do that piece of it. So yeah.
It's mostly stainless steel at this point, I think, just for scale, but yeah.
But fun stuff.
No,
and that piece of it, the cider piece of it, I didn't even get into the cider piece of it because that's a whole mystery to me. It is. It's you do have to be a scientist, and there are notebooks, well, tablets or whatever, downstairs of collecting data. Oh, that's another thing I should say, that we actually GPSed every single one of our trees and companions, but the trees most importantly. And we go and this part of the permaculture observation, we go and we collect data of like who's flowering, who got what insect. Part of the insect thing is that I have horses, and so we have to ride through the orchard and see, and then we actually hand pluck when we see things and stuff like that. And then we also record that, and it goes into the database, and ultimately that database links to the cider database with different flavor profiles and see what predicts what, and sort of more the sciencey fun piece of it for how those pieces all fit together.
I don't know if you, sorry, let's say.
There's another.
Yeah, so we're about out of time, Catherine, but I do want to just say thank you so much. I sort of a running theme throughout all of our talks this week has been the intersectionality between all of these systems, and it's just been a tremendous way to sort of deepen these conversations, and it's really exciting. And speaking of intersectionality, you are also a proud graduate of our Wyndham Grows program.
Yes.
On our Business Accelerator program.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for participating.
It's a great, put in a plug for that program, because that was a great program, and it offered a lot of resources and interactions with other, like-minded people. And even if they're not doing exactly, there was nobody in my cohort that was specifically doing cider per se or anything like that. But the ability to connect with other people who are doing the same thing as you, the same theme as you, was just so powerful and really inspirational in terms of getting ideas and, going forward. And the unfun stuff, like the financial stuff, there was a lot of help there too about how to really think about accounting and the orchard versus the cider. And for other people it was a little bit different, but everybody had access to those resources, which was really terrific, really terrific.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks again. Thank you, Jen, for this whole week. Jen has been my partner in crime for this entire week. And she's invaluable. So thank you, Jen. Thanks to all of our attendees. We will be getting all of these recordings out to you and all of the materials that you've requested over this week. So be on the lookout for emails from us. with all of this stuff. Catherine, again, thank you so much. This has just been such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. It was really great.
Yeah, great. Okay. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.